And if you looked at a particular place over Secret Mountain, you would see this big orb being escorted by helicopters rising from behind Secret Mountain. And we watched at 1:30 in the morning, and sure enough, up comes this beautiful golden orb, gigantic. It pulses, it's plasmatic.
And so where my mind might go with that is that this is some sort of global control system.
Got an object about a mile behind us and it's following us. Let's hope they're friendly.
One of the first things that one of my sources in that Georgetown pub back in probably 2018 told me was, it's all about consciousness.
You've probably met more people in and around these programs than anybody else alive.
You are saying to the human race, we are not alone.
We're definitely not alone.
Anyway, he chuckled. And I remember he just let slip something like, yeah, the Americans wanted that one shut down pretty quickly.
Whoa. It's a multi-minute long video of this thing flying in the air. And there are symbols around the top. I showed photos of the symbols to Mario Woods and to Randy Anderson, and both of them freaked out.
We went to his home and saw this sphere apparently move under its own power. People have been murdered. Because I'm told that the briefing that the FBI gave in Congress really blew people away. I have no doubt they think they're going to get away with it. And you know what?
Why?
They probably will.
I'm here with Ross Coulthart, who I have just so much gratitude to express. First of all, we've been waiting to do this for a very long time. I'm grateful you're in the U.S.
I haven't been avoiding you.
I know you haven't. But I just want to express my gratitude because we were talking before when the cameras weren't rolling. I feel like I am aerodynamically drafting behind you. I feel like you have done so much legwork in getting all these amazing scoops. And, often I'll do, a follow-up interview where, I have a lot of fun. But it's really, I just have so much, I owe you a debt. And I think humanity owes you a debt as well. And so I'm grateful for you sitting down.
It's a mutual admiration society, Jesse, because I often say to my family, how the hell does he do it? you seem like a jackrabbit everywhere I see. I mean, have you just come back from Colombia or something? You're doing a Buga sphere story?
I was in, this is what's crazy. And I know you've experienced, I'm sure, all sorts of stories where like it starts a certain way and then you have another story come up. So I was investigating these Peruvian mummies, these tridactyl, three-toed and fingered mummies from Peru. And then on the way back up to the U.S., I stop in Mexico City to meet with Jaime Maussan, who's a big proponent of this. And 2 days before, he happened to get this Buga sphere sent to him or whatever. And so I happened to be there.
I've got to know, what's your preliminary assessment? Is it real?
It's so hard to say.
Did you see what my friend Roni Vernay posted on Twitter?
Repeat it for the audience.
A fuel tank. And so there's a particular shape of fuel tank that is exactly 9 liters, and it's got similar holes to the one that Yami is relying on. And it does have the same seam running along the side. It looks like a direct visual match with a few changes, as if somebody's cosmetically altered it.
It's definitely remarkable, just the fact pattern. So, as you know very well, whenever you take a hard stance in this world, you get a ton of flack. So I'll just give you my fact pattern of what I've experienced, and then people can sort of decide for themselves. So Jaime Maussan was given this thing. It was taken in Buga, Colombia. That's why it's called the Buga sphere. It was given by a guy. So this video was taken by this guy who is, I guess he does mining and metal detection underground. And it's a multi-minute long video of this thing flying in the air. You've seen the video. And then he picks it up in the forest, and there is a little gap in the video. So that does beget a question of provenance and why is there a gap in the video? And then he has it for a while in his possession. He ends up giving it to Jaime Maussan. And there are symbols around the top. Apparently it's an aluminum alloy that's, 3 times the hardness of what we generally use in conventional aerospace. And then maybe the most interesting fact I can give you that is new to the audience as well is I showed photos of the symbols to Mario Woods and to Randy Anderson. Mario Woods, 1977 Ellsworth Air Force Base experiencer. And then Randy Anderson is this guy who was taken underground, at Crane, Naval Surface Warfare Crane, and was possibly shown some off-world technology. And both of them freaked out because it was like these were the symbols that they had both seen. Mario inside the craft. Yeah.
I want to give you something because I'm not sure. And again, I am not avowing that this is my opinion.
Neither of us are endorsing the Buga sphere. We are these are facts that we are
neither endorsing nor debunking.
That's right.
But I did what I'm increasingly doing these days. I took a photograph of the sphere and I uploaded it to AI, and I asked AI, in this case I think it was Grusch, and I said, can you please decipher these symbols for me? And it came back very quickly and said, the circuit. And that, I have to admit, made me think it was a hoax. Now, I'm not saying it's a hoax, okay? But what I am saying is that came back when I put it through AI. But AI is often wrong. But what I love about AI is that its ability to draw on symbology and numerology and all of these ideas. And it came back with this one phrase, the circuit.
Well, if you look at the top, it looks like a little semiconductor or a chip.
Yeah.
And then you have, this begets all these ontological questions of like you have, I think his name is Patrick Jackson.
Yes.
You've done an amazing story. Everybody go watch Ross's story with this guy.
And I have seen one of these spheres in a different domain, in the home of a beautiful man in Texas who is a good soul. And I can tell you, it may be the case that his sphere is now in the possession of Brandon Fugel, and the Skinwalker Ranch show is going to be paying to have that sphere properly investigated. There's a scoop for you.
That is,
I was going to run it on my show. So Jim Marlin is a former rock promoter who worked with Willie Nelson, and he has a house in Texas. And we went to his home and saw this sphere. I have to be careful. Apparently move under its own power. And I mean, we were sitting with Jim for hours talking, and he was in a home where the floor had just been fixed, so it's perfectly level, and we verified that with a level. And the ball is sitting stationary on the floor, and then all of a sudden it starts moving, and there's a bar which has a pole coming down onto the floor. It goes up to the bar, and from memory it might have even circled the pole and then come back again part of the way. And there was no movement. We were all just sitting in a chair talking, and then Jim chortles and goes, oh, look at that. And it moves. Yeah. Was
there something that came up in the conversation? Was it aligned with anything synchronous?
No. And so when I ran that story on Channel 7 Australia, they, as usual, as TV networks are wont to do, beat the living daylights out of it, which is a journalistic term for flogging the story until it bleeds. And all the promos were fancy, and it made it look like we were saying for sure that it was an anomalous object. We truly don't know for sure. And the great frustration for me for the past few years since I did that story in 2021 is every time I went to Jim and asked him, could we take it to go and get it tested, there was a lot of resistance. And it made me suspicious. But then he agreed to go and let it get tested. But the problem was when I was trying to find an X-ray place that does industrial X-rays, the first thing they want to know is, well, what's inside it? And I'm going, well, that's why we want to X-ray it. And I was expressing this dilemma only very recently on a show somewhere, and this gentleman rang me from Chicago and said that he would X-ray it in his industrial X-ray machine, and he had some other type of machine. Can't remember what it was. Might have been a CT. I'm not sure. Yeah, and he would run it through that as well, and it was for free. And I went to Jim and I said to Jim, I finally found a place that can test the ball for you, the sphere for you, because one of the things I get a lot of the inquiries about from our audience is, what happened to the sphere? Why haven't you told us the story about the sphere? And I was finally about to announce that we've got somebody who will allow us to do the testing on the sphere, because Jim won't let us cut into it for obvious reasons. And he told me, I'm sorry, Ross, Brandon Fugel's agreed to fly it in his private jet to Utah, where he's going to have it tested in the lab. And look, frankly, I'm really happy if that's going to be the case for Patrick, who I know, and for Jim, who's a beautiful guy, to finally get an answer. And Brandon, I've spoken to Brandon about it, and I've encouraged him to do it. And so hopefully it's all going to happen. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, let's hope. That's amazing. And I think Patrick, because you were talking about the chip, and so where my mind might go with that, again, I don't know if it's real, is that this is some sort of like global control system or something.
Well, Patrick's theory is that these spheres are part of a global defense system by some alien civilization to keep the bad guys out of Earth.
Right.
And I quite like Patrick. He's a very clever man.
Yeah.
He has an eclectic intelligence and he's fun. I honestly don't know how he could know that.
Right.
You know,
Sure.
And so, I mean, a lot of it is speculation. And he's
Yes.
got type 1 spheres and type 2 spheres. And often there'll be a photograph of a plane.
Yeah.
And you see these spheres around planes in UAP events. So there's often a big, let's call it object rather than a craft. There's a big object that's clearly anomalous, sometimes beside an aircraft. And then if you look really closely, you'll see these dots that are these metallic spheres. And when I did that story, I did that in 2021 for Australian TV, it just went nuts. It's been seen, that particular story, if you add the two iterations of the story, because we had to take one down because of copyright issues with music. It's been seen over 43 million times.
Crazy.
And so I was getting phone calls, messages, emails from people all over the world, including, I remember, a beautiful guy in Africa who told me that they were seeing these spheres. And what I can report is whatever they are, I do think I can say they're real. They're a real phenomenon. Whatever they are, they're metal spheres with no visible means of propulsion. Dozens of people have told me that they've seen them flying or moving under their own locomotive power. There's no visible way in which they're moving, and I don't honestly know what to conclude about them because, I mean, I expressed the enigma by telling the story, but like so much of this whole story, Jesse, I don't know about you, but I often feel like I've got my eyes closed and I'm kind of feeling in the dark and trying to get an idea about what it is. And then as soon as I've got the texture and the feel of what's been in front of me here, I realized there's a whole other room over here of stuff that I've never got my brain around. And it's mind-bogglingly complex, whatever it is.
This episode is brought to you by my favorite new product, Masa Chips. Here's a quick history lesson. Before the 1990s, all chips and fries were cooked in beef tallow. Then the big food companies swapped this ingredient out for cheap, highly processed seed oils. Today, seed oils make up 20% of the average American's calories, and they're linked to all sorts of bad things like chronic inflammation and metabolic issues. Masa decided to rewind the clock. They make tortilla chips with just 3 simple ingredients: organic corn, sea salt, and 100% grass-fed beef tallow. No seed oils, no weird additives, and honestly, they taste way better too. Masa chips are crunchier, more flavorful, and they don't disintegrate in guac like the usual ones. But the real difference is how you feel: light, satisfied, no crash, no bloat, and no weird craving spiral an hour later. I've been snacking on them non-stop while working on these shows, and they actually keep me sharp. Masa chips are beloved by tens of thousands of customers and have been endorsed by industry-leading health and nutrition experts like Ben Greenfield and Gary Brecka. So ready to give Masa a try? Go to masachips.com/Jesse Michels, Michels with no A, and use code Jesse Michels for 25% off your first order. That's masachips.com/Jesse Michels and use code Jesse Michels for 25% off your first order. You're really helping the channel out when you use that code, and this is a product I love and consume just about every day. part of what I want to do in this interview is so many people are used to seeing you in the context of breaking these bombshell stories. I want to get to know the man behind that, because you are often the interviewer. And so how did you were, exposing corruption and stuff with the surveillance state in Australia, right? How did you get into UFOs to begin with?
Like every kid, I was obsessed with Doctor Who, and I loved a show called UFO that was on TV. It was a British series about malevolent aliens invading Earth, and there was this secret organization called Shadow that was defending Earth. But I'll be honest, I always saw that as fiction, and I accepted it was fiction. I never believed it was true. And even when in New Zealand, where I was living as a kid, there was a really big UFO incident in 1978 when I was 16 years old in a place called Kaikoura on the east coast of the South Island of New Zealand. And there was a cargo aircraft flying up that coastline in 1978 in the middle of the night. And the pilot and the co-pilot had these objects, clearly, in their view, elliptical, metallic, disc-shaped objects come right up to the cockpit window, glowing, but clearly metallic, and then go away again. And what was interesting was that it was another kind of Nimitz story, because you had sensor systems. I found the guy in Wellington across Cook Strait, who was the radar operator on the night, who'd seen these things on radar. And as the two guys who were the journalists on the aircraft were describing the objects, say, going to the west, the radar operator, John Cordy, was seeing them go to the west.
I have a strong target at 12 o'clock to you at 20 miles.
Roger, we have that one also, and quite a good visual display at the moment.
It's showing light.
It looks like a collection of lights.
Okay.
So you had this contemporaneous, real-time confirmation of solid objects moving, or at least objects that registered on radar, moving in the directions that these witnesses were saying that they were seeing these objects moving. And they were seeing objects that were plasmatically glowing, but at the same time clearly solid, structured, in their words, craft.
We just heard from Wellington radar that we've got an object about a mile behind us and it's following us. Let's hope they're friendly.
Sierra Alpha Echo, there's a strong target right in formation with you now. Could either be left or right, but your target is double its size.
And for each of those people, it was a transformative moment. But what was really interesting for me as a journalist was I bought, as a teenage boy, the official government explanation. And I was doing my exams. I was really focused on my studies. There'd been the Valentich story of a young boy called Frederick Valentich who had disappeared in his Cessna aircraft flying over Bass Strait in Australia just a few months before. And as somebody who was really already very interested in the media, I kind of bought into the idea that this is all a big media beat-up because there's a big problem in the December, January period. It's the Christmas holiday period. The news is pretty boring. And so this was obviously a story that the media had leapt onto. And I just thought, yeah, this is just a big media beat-up. What was interesting also was that the government had come out with an official explanation very, very quickly, which said that these were squid boat lights. And in New Zealand, there are these big Japanese fishing fleets that go off the coast with these gigantic lights. And you often saw them as a kid. And they were glowing on the horizon and they looked spooky. And so the theory that was pushed by the New Zealand Air Force was that these were squid boats lights, and the captain, the co-pilot of one plane, and the captain and the co-pilot of another plane, even though they were flying at 14,000 feet, they were mistaken, and those objects were below them, and it was some kind of refraction in the air, blah, 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 blah. It all gave a reasonable tinge of explanation that made everybody in New Zealand think, that was just a bullshit story during the Christmas season. It's all over. For me, though, it was interesting because much, much later when I became a journalist, I was working for the New Zealand Herald newspaper, and I met Sir Robert Muldoon, who was the former New Zealand Prime Minister. And he used to do these convivial little chats at Christmas time where a young reporter, me, had to drive up and interview him and talk to the former Prime Minister about whatever he wanted to talk about. And I decided, I don't know why, I knew he'd been the Prime Minister at the time. I decided to ask him, what about that Kaikoura UFO thing that happened when I was 16? And by that time, I think I was about 19 or 20, I can't remember. Anyway, he chuckled. And I remember he just let slip something like, yeah, the Americans wanted that one shut down pretty quickly.
Whoa.
And that, because I love espionage stories, and I love, as a young New Zealander, I was always focused on books about espionage. And as you referred to earlier, one of the biggest stories I did in my time in Australia was I revealed the existence exclusively of the Echelon communications surveillance system, which is what the Five Eyes operate to intercept communications. And for the first time ever, I got from an intelligence service in Australia an official admission that there was a system called Echelon, and it was involved in communications surveillance and spying. And so I was switched on to that issue all my life. I've always been really interested in spies and espionage. And so it twigged my interest that Sir Robert Muldoon was describing this admission that there'd been some kind of American intervention, but he wouldn't go any further. And then much, much later, when I was writing my book, I discovered that there'd been this release of the New Zealand archives in about 2011, and it essentially revealed the detail of what went on inside the Air Force in New Zealand to try and fix this problem as fast as possible. And it was quite clear these Air Force officers had been told, find a fucking solution as fast as possible. We want this off the front page. And it was quite clear enormous amounts of pressure was being put on the Chief of Air Staff, the head of the Air Force, by the Prime Minister's office to make this one go away, and hence the squid boat explanation. And then when I was writing my book, I met Quentin Fogarty, who'd been one of the reporters on the plane, who by complete chance, his son Ben was one of the chief cameramen at 60 Minutes, where I was working as a reporter. And so Ben said to me, my dad was the guy who was on that plane that night. And so I got to meet his father, another weird serendipity. And another one of the reporters was a political correspondent called Dennis Grant, of great renown later on in Australia. And Dennis confirmed all the story. And he introduced me to Bruce Maccabee, who was the atmospheric physicist who sadly recently died. And all of a sudden I realized that the story that I'd bought as a young teenage kid that basically told me this was bullshit was actually completely untrue. And there'd been a really elaborate cover-up. And that fascinated me. And it was one of the, because I actually started out writing my book in about 2018 when I left 60 Minutes. I thought I wanted to do a book debunking UFOs. I was arrogant, and I had this assumption that all UFOs were nonsense, and it was only a matter of time. I'd read Nick Cook's Hunt for Zero Point, and he'd implied very strongly that there was some sort of secret US aerospace program. We obviously have all heard all the rumors about the Aurora or the TR-3B, and I just assumed it was some kind of black world American technology, and that a bit of dutiful digging would no doubt reveal this, and somehow, for some inescapable reason, I would discover it and make my name by revealing that the whole UFO story was complete nonsense. But the more I got into the story, because of that Kaikoura story, everywhere I went, everybody was telling me this is real. And so I had sources from the original Echelon investigation I'd done, and from people I'd met in Afghanistan and Iraq when I covered the war, who were in senior levels in intelligence and defense. And they facilitated introductions for me to people who privately, when we sat over a table in a bar, said, Ross, this is real.
Yeah.
And that only really happened for me more recently, while I was writing my book. And probably the biggest breakthrough moment for me, where I went, holy heck, this is real, is when the technique I'd used to try and investigate this was, because of my knowledge of Echelon and how easy it is to intercept digital communications, I decided I wouldn't approach anybody that I thought might know something about this other than by using analog communication techniques. I wouldn't even use phones because, of course, there's a metadata, and we knew about that because of the Snowden revelations, that there was this metadata trail that essentially reveals that you can be tracked. And they might not know the contents of the phone conversation, but they can certainly track a lot about your habits and your movements and who you're talking to by looking at the metadata. And so I wrote letters.
Wow.
And so I wrote, I think, about 160, 170 letters at last count. And a lot of it involved doing things like, I'm a lawyer by training, and so as a young trainee lawyer, I'd learned that a lot of stinky stuff happens in the discovery process and legal proceedings with documents that are maybe procured but not necessarily tendered in a court case. And they're often tangential to what you're trying to discover to prove the case that you're mounting, but there's some really juicy stuff in there. And so I don't want to go into too much detail, but there were some very helpful lawyers. And so I built up a name base of people that I thought might be interesting who'd been involved in litigation at Area 51. And in a layering and iterative process of doing what I do, which is basic investigative journalism, where you build up a chronology and you think who might know something about advanced aerospace, or who might have been working in a security role or a support role at that time in this area that might know something. You build up a name base. And so I wrote letters to people. And one of the glorious things about America is how ridiculously open every database is. And I could procure the home addresses of everybody that I wanted to write to, including some of the most important scientists in America.
Wow.
And what shocked me was one of the letters I wrote was to a guy called Nat Kobitz. And he was the former head of science technology development for the US Navy. And I'd written to him as an act of brazen cheek, to be perfectly honest. I honestly did not expect that somebody like him would respond.
What did Kobitz say?
He rang me, and I didn't talk UFOs with him for 3 months. And I realized, sadly, one of the reasons he wanted to talk to me was because he was a lonely, elderly man who, God bless him, was dying slowly of cancer. And he was in his daughter's home, and she was nursing him, and he was bored. And I was interested in talking to him, and he was talking to me about developing early drone technology and how one of their drones had crashed in George Bush, the president's ranch, because the Secret Service had frequency blockers. And, they'd spent millions of dollars on building this drone, and the first time they flew it, because they flew into the Secret Service envelope, it crashed, and he went, there went a few $1,000,000, and he had this wonderful Jewish Brooklyn sense of humor. And I became very friendly with him, and I used to really enjoy talking to him. There were things like he'd been involved in developing things on the lunar lander, and I knew somebody who'd worked on the lunar lander, and they told me something about the lunar lander, and because Nate knew about that, we bounced off that, and it just got more and more interesting. And then one day I rang him, and he was getting really ill. And I could hear a kind of a change in his voice, and I felt really sad because it was obvious he was ill. And he went, "Why don't you ask me the question?"
No way.
He was the guy who suggested I ask it.
Oh, wow. He kind of knew you were.
Oh, yeah. He knew why I was there. Yeah, I'd made no secret that I was writing a book about UFOs.
You know how we're always diving into the edge of science and consciousness on this show? Lately, I've been thinking a lot about aging, not just in terms of years, but in how it actually feels in the body. Slow recovery, lower energy, that middle-aged fog that sneaks up on you. I feel like I can barely go out and drink alcohol anymore. That's why I started using something called Qualia Senolytic, and it's been a major shift for me. Let me explain. As we age, our bodies accumulate what scientists call senescent cells, also known as zombie cells. These are worn-out cells that stop dividing but don't die. They hang around in your body, draining your energy, clogging up your recovery, and generally making you feel older than you are. Qualia Senolytic is a first-of-its-kind supplement formulated with 9 plant-based compounds designed to help your body naturally eliminate these zombie cells. It's not something you take every day, just 2 days a month, but it supports your body in aging better at the cellular level. Since I've started taking it, I've felt sharper, lighter, and like my body's resilience has come back online. It's vegan, non-GMO, and grounded in serious research. Experience the science of feeling younger. Go to qualialife.com/Jesse for up to 50% off your purchase and use code Jesse. Again, that's JESSE for an additional 15% off. That's QUALIALIFE.com/Jesse, JESSE, for an extra 15% off your purchase. Thanks so much to Qualia for sponsoring this episode.
Why don't you ask me the question? And I was nervous. I was actually slightly nervous. And I've never released it, but I've actually got a recording of this.
Oh my God.
And he had authorized me to record it.
Of course.
And I went, I've been agonizing about how to ask you this question. And he went, third time, why don't you just ask me the question? And so I went, have you ever been read in to any kind of program involving unidentified aerial phenomena, alien technology? And before I finished answering the question, he went, yes.
Wow.
And he'd obviously made the decision to answer the question. And I actually didn't hear him the first time he said it.
Uh-huh.
I was expecting him to go, no, I don't know. Because everybody was saying, no, I don't know anything about what you're talking about. And, well, actually, no, that wasn't true. I'd already had people confirm the retrieval program. But there was a kind of a beat, 1, 2, and then I went, what?
Yeah.
And I, out of respect to Nat and his family, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail of the remaining parts of the conversation, because what he then did for me was incredible. He facilitated introductions to people, and that was my big breakthrough.
Wow.
And
will that conversation ever come out?
I think I'd want his family's okay about it.
Sure.
Because it's an emotional thing, I think, for a family to hear a father's voice after he's been passed for so long.
Yeah.
But he was a beautiful guy, and it was an act of courage on his part. And I remember one of the conversations I had with him was, do you think there's any good reason? Because this is the thing I wrestle with, I know you do as well. What's the dirty secret?
Right.
Why? Why can't we know this? If the US has recovered technology, why can't we know? And he hadn't been told that. And he had that rigid doctrinaire thing about how he wasn't read into that part of it. And that was a compartmentalized issue he wasn't entitled to know about. What he told me was that he'd been told that the United States had recovered multiple craft.
Wow.
Multiple craft. And he implied very strongly that Roswell and another case I'm interested in, Aztec and Kingman, were all real incidents. And that really rocked my worldview. And but what happened was he also told me that because there was another time I asked him, I said, have you ever actually seen evidence of alien technology? And he went, no. And I was kind of disappointed, because it implied that he had.
Yeah.
And then he gave me this cheeky look, and because we were talking on Zoom, and I said, have you ever been given anomalous technology that defied prosaic explanation? And he went, like he had the first time, yes.
Wow.
And then he told me this amazing story about how he was an expert in a particular type of welding called electron beam welding.
Okay.
And apparently his company had done the nose wheel for the C-47, one of the big cargo planes used by the US military, and they need really tough welds. And this is one of the strongest welds you can do of metals. And he was like the world expert with his company in that type of welding. And it's an indistinguishable bead, unlike, I don't know if you've ever welded, but welds leave a big bead. This type of welding didn't. And so he was contacted on his own admission by Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And I think it was even whatever the technology division is known as now. I think it might be the Foreign Technology Exploitation, something or other.
FTE, yeah.
And he was flown to Wright-Pat.
Yeah.
And he did go underground. I remember I giggled and I said, "Did you go underground?" He went, "Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah." It was obviously a long way down. And he was taken into a room under heavy guard and shown what he described to me as the piece of a bulkhead. And he said it looked like it should have been incredibly heavy, but it was almost lightweight, like a feather.
Yeah.
And he said what blew him away was, and I don't know enough about metallurgy to know this, but he said there were two types of metal, and he wouldn't tell me what types of metal they were, that had been bonded. And he asked to look at it, I think, under an electron scanning microscope. And the scientist in him couldn't resist giving that sense of awe about what he saw, that he said it was bonded at the atomic level.
Whoa.
Whoever had built this had layered it atom by atom. And he said, I know for a fact that's not a technology, certainly, that I'm aware of, and I would have thought that I would have known.
Yeah, I think like semiconductors, you can do little amounts of atomic layer deposition, but you can't fabricate at scale materials that are atomically, where you're deliberately placing atoms. You just can't do that.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So I think for me, the big aha moment where I stopped being the skeptic and went, holy fuck, this is real. I can't believe this. And I remember I actually spent days just going for walks because I was writing my book, and it had actually altered. I had a confirmational bias.
Yeah.
I was writing a book to debunk all this nonsense.
Yeah.
And this guy is telling me it's true.
Is this in plain sight, by the way, that you were writing at the time?
Yeah. And the great thing about it was I was doing a lot of traveling for 60 Minutes and Channel 7, two big networks in Australia, and I was often in America. And as part of cost cutting, they'd often leave you in a hotel for a few days while you shared the crew with another reporter. And so you'd have downtime when really all you wanted to do was be with your family. And you're sitting in a hotel in Washington or New York. And it sounds like fun, I know. And once you've tried on the fluffy dressing gown and used the bath salts once, you're just a bit bored.
Yeah.
And so I would, I'd research things. And I was going to the National Archives and reading a lot of the old archives on UFOs. And then Nat organized for me to start meeting people. And that was like UAP 101. And there was just this conga line of people coming through an apartment I rented that were brave, amazing people.
It's amazing. Well, it's amazing how deeply embedded you became, because if I remember correctly, Grusch had come out and you guys had had some mutual contacts before he came out.
Yeah, that's true.
And with Jake Barber, I believe you knew him for like a couple of years before he came out.
I can't say how long I knew Overman, but basically it's just to protect them. Basically, I learned about David Grusch from people in the program.
I just think that's important for the audience to hear, because they think it's some like choreographed thing or whatever.
No, that's like, people have always got this idea that all that happens is these people come to you and you interview them, and it's a really lazy job.
Yeah.
And they have no idea. Honestly, I used to have a full head of hair, and the job of it's a bit like you. I really admire the way you do your stuff, because you actually know a lot of science and a lot of physics, and you do. And I love the way you demonstrate that knowledge in the shows that you do.
Thank you.
Whereas I honestly am not a scientist, but what I do is I'm really good, and I learned this at law school, at absorbing huge amounts of information, complex information, and analyzing it and understanding it and making sure I understand it. Because at law school, we had the Socratic method where you were tested orally about your understanding of something, and you were put on the spot by the lecturer and questioned in front of 300 other students. And if you didn't know your stuff, you were humiliated and vilified. And I was never going to let that happen. And I was humiliated and vilified on constant occasions. And
so you're like Pavlovian conditioned into
yeah,
being
yeah,
a great orator.
It's terror training. Yeah,
that's right.
And so I learned subjects so that I could hold conversations with people, and I'd read Scientific American articles and try and understand them, and I, for the life of me, couldn't. And I'd get friendly physicists or neuroscientists to explain things to me. And it's by demonstrating a knowledge or an understanding, or just enough to be able to have a conversation with somebody, that increases the flow. And so sometimes I'd come out of a conversation and I'd go, I think I've got what they're talking about. And there's a lot of ideas that people were discussing with me that, frankly, now that I'm into consciousness and psionics and stuff like that, I'm only now beginning to understand. And it's 7 years since I had those conversations. And
it's wild how much your kind of aperture opens up getting it. I mean, I'm curious as to like how you feel now, because you've broken all these stories. You can't really argue with the substance of a lot of the stories. You can't argue with the people's backgrounds, their credentials. Like you can't really do that. And so I imagine you feel like you're on this like remote island, and then like you have, I feel this at least, you have like mainstream media or news, and they just, it's like they can't even comprehend like where you are.
It's funny. I'm so glad you've led me into this path, because I'm going to give you my rant. I think there will come a time in the not too distant future where there will be a bloody reckoning with the failure of the mainstream media in the main to deal with the greatest disinformation operation in human history.
Yes, yeah.
It has been the most effective psyop ever run.
Yeah. But you also realize when talking to a lot of these people, the psyop, maybe it's at the top. Like, okay, I'll give you a crazy story.
Sure.
A friend of mine was planning an op-ed with a former cabinet member in the U.S. The cabinet member wanted to know where they were expressing frustration about their lack of access to UFO stuff. I decided to help him out because he was having trouble with the Wall Street Journal getting this published, which is just prima facie crazy if you take that claim at face value. Yeah. Even just the fact that the cabinet member is claiming it.
Well, what made the New York Times publish it in 2017? The mere fact that the Pentagon was looking at UFOs was a story.
There you go. That is a story, right? And so, and then you get into all these questions of like, why did the New York Times reject the Grusch story? It's crazy. But in this case, I'm talking to this journalist at the Wall Street Journal trying to help my friend out. And she's actually somewhat open-minded, but like she just, it's one of these things where it's like, it seems so beyond the pale. And if you don't understand the deeper research and you haven't gone down the rabbit hole, it's kind of like in one ear out the other. And she then says, I don't know, we have this like consultant that we talk to about UFOs here. And his name is David Spergel. And you know where I'm going with this. And David Spergel tells me that it's all space trash, temperature inversions, and light reflections. And in my head, I'm thinking that's exactly what Don Menzel would say in the 50s to throw people off the trail. And David Spergel not only did the NASA UAP review panel in 2023, but he happens to run the Simons Foundation, as a scientific advisor, and is very embedded in DOE research. And that's where, if you know what we both know, that's where the bodies are buried.
Absolutely. No, and it's funny. I one of the things in my line of work is we have a vulgar expression, which is always assume a fuck up before a conspiracy. Like conspiracies happen so rarely. And invariably it's the screw ups that are the explanation rather than active conspiracy. In this case, I have been led reluctantly to the conclusion this is a conspiracy, that there really is a group, a cabal, a leadership cabal that is actively conniving to deceive the public.
Why do you think that, going back to your earlier question of like, what's the big deal? Why do you think they hide it?
I think they've convinced themselves, because I actually asked somebody from Lockheed Martin this.
Yeah, perfect. What's up, guys? I want to tell you about my new favorite boots. These things are epic. I've been wearing these everywhere. They're called Brunt. They're insanely comfortable and durable. These things last for years, and they're super versatile. I wear them for hiking, for hanging out. They look pretty swaggy if you're going out. They even look good in work meetings. They feel incredibly comfortable. There's no annoying break-in period. They just kind of form fit to your foot right off the bat. They're lightweight. You don't have to lug them around, but they're also super weather resistant, waterproof, and durable. Brunt is committed to making sure you're 100% satisfied with your new gear. With over 500,000 customers already on board, these boots are the best in the category. Take it from me. Brunt makes the most epic, durable, and comfortable work boots. For a limited time, our listeners get $10 off at Brunt by using code Jesse at checkout. Just head to bruntworkwear.com and use code Jesse and you're all set. Even better, Brunt lets you try all their products on the job risk-free. Just go to bruntworkwear.com and use code Jesse for $10 off. Again, that's bruntworkwear.com, code Jesse. After you purchase, they will ask you where you heard about them. Please support our show and tell them that we sent you.
So somebody rang me out of the blue from Lockheed Martin. I won't say who they are and convey who they are, but they were an executive, a very senior executive. And we were playing a delicate dance. They'd heard me say something, and they were thanking me for not putting them in it and for more accurately reflecting the true state of events about something. And essentially it was an implicit acknowledgement by that Lockheed Martin executive that they are holding alien technology. And I just blurted it out. I said, look, can I ask you a question? I said, I promise you I'm not recording you. Why?
Yeah.
Why not just come out and say it? And he said, it's not us.
Yeah.
He said, it's the agency.
Interesting.
He said, we want to do it. And then that's how I found out about the attempt by Bigelow Aerospace.
Right.
Because this bullshit story about metamaterials that, God bless them, Leslie and Ralph put in the New York Times story, that was always nonsense. It wasn't metamaterials. It was a spacecraft.
Right.
Lockheed Martin was going to pass on control of an alien spacecraft to Bigelow Aerospace. That's the real story.
And you hear rumors that maybe it was the Kingman craft in 1953. Yeah.
And so the interesting thing is the CIA intervened to stop that from happening, or at least the Office of Global Access, as it was once known.
And it was Glenn Gaffney, right? It was now.
It's interesting. I'm not 100% sure it was Glenn Gaffney.
Okay.
People have denied that from the inside, but I don't know if that's disinformation.
Okay.
Glenn Gaffney's definitely been involved in the cover-up.
Right. Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah.
And Australia, I remember when I first met you, it was at the Soul Foundation a couple years ago.
Right.
And Australia has its own fascinating history that I remember asking you about at the time. You have this guy named Harry Turner.
Oh, I love Harry Turner.
Tell us about Harry Turner.
Well, good friend of mine, Bill Chalker, who's probably Australia's preeminent UAP researcher, he got to know Harry really well while Harry was alive. And Harry had been, in his youth, as a young 20-something, a young physicist recently qualified from Melbourne University, and he expressed an interest in investigating UFOs to the then government. And they'd invited him to come on board back in those more learned and insightful days when governments didn't try and hide evidence of UFOs. They invited this young physicist in to analyze UFO sightings because they were, like the Americans, trying to investigate them. And we were involved in a collaborative relationship with America, providing information to Project Blue Book, handing over some of the more interesting Australian and New Zealand sightings cases. And there was a collaborative exchange of data and information, which there still is secretly, but I won't get to that until later. But the interesting thing is Harry Turner somehow fell into the Maralinga nuclear test program. And when the British were developing their nuclear weapon, God bless the British, they let their bombs off in the middle of Australia. And I've been involved in doing stories about what a dreadful scandal that was and how
the Woomera
Aboriginal people died in their droves from horrible cancers, and so did the servicemen who were involved in supervising the tests. But there's two ranges. There's the Maralinga range where the bombs were tested, and there's the Woomera range where they tested the ICBMs. And Woomera is still very active. It's where the Americans have secretly been testing hypersonic missile technology. And there's a huge level of collaboration secretly between Australia and the US, where a lot of your dirty aerospace gets brought out to Australia. And funnily enough, it's neither here nor there. I've had many Aboriginal communities that are often the only communities out there in these remote parts of Australia who've described black triangles flying over their communities, silent black triangles.
Wow.
Something is, I'm sure, being tested in the Australian outback.
Wow.
But Harry, whenever the nuclear tests started, I think it was in the 1950s and into the 60s, he was the supervising physicist on the range at Maralinga. And he was invited to investigate multiple UAP sightings that took place at Maralinga during the sightings. And there are still reports in the archives of those UAP sightings, and I put a lot of them in my book. And there's a young fella who I've just put an article of his up on a website in Australia, Rhys Dalton Moore, and he's basically, his grandfather ran the Woomera test range. And it turns out he was secretly involved in investigating, Rhys Dalton Morgan, I apologise, and his grandfather was involved in secret investigations with the British government in the late 1940s in Britain into UFOs. And so it turned out there's this whole area of physicists, including Harry Turner, who were witness to UFO incidents in their droves in the Maralinga and Woomera test range areas during the 50s and the 60s. And so after he'd done that work, Harry went on to work in the equivalent of the DIA, the Defence Intelligence Agency in Australia, which at the time was known as the Joint Intelligence Organisation, JIO. And he, in 1972, wrote an extraordinary paper, which lots of people keep on sending me going, wow, you must read this, Ross. You wouldn't know about this. And I've blooming written chapters about it and talked about it for years. I find it fascinating. Harry wrote this definitive piece, which basically was a report to the chief of JIO recommending that the Defence Department of Australia set up a UFO flying squad to investigate UFOs. And it was under serious, active consideration. You can see that they weren't going to dismiss their chief scientist in a hurry. And he made a very authoritative argument that the Americans were essentially lying. And I have a strong suspicion, because there was an enormous amount of liaison between physicists from America and physicists from Australia, that there was a bit of cross-pollination, that Harry had picked up stuff from American nuclear physicists who were aware of the early stages of the American legacy program.
Well, you told me one time that, like, some of the graybeards you've spoken to in the Australian context talked about Robert Sarbacher coming and visiting them. And obviously
Robert Sarbacher was definitely involved in liaison. And the most interesting thing is a lot of the Australian scientists, including Harry at one stage, went on expeditions to the Pacific tests, because the Americans were trying to suck up to us for exploding bombs in our backyard, by inviting us to be part of these tests and to be witnesses to them. And of course, they were polluting vast parts of Micronesia and spraying nuclear residue all over huge parts of the Marshall Islands and Johnson Atoll, huge numbers of communities. I've been out to the Marshall Islands and Johnson Atoll briefly, and it is really quite amazing to think that they were exploding thermonuclear weapons in the open. But I think there was a lot of cross-pollination there as well between Australian scientists and American scientists. And it's pretty obvious. Harry picked up a lot of information, and he wrote this absolutely candid analysis that the Americans clearly have some kind of retrieval program. He talked about Roswell, he talked about other retrievals, and he talked about how the Americans were clearly keeping this from us. And look, even in present day, this is strategically significant for us in Australia, because I was involved in 1994, that's how old I am, in another story about spies, where I revealed that our intelligence service, the equivalent of the CIA, ASIS in Australia, did plausibly deniable favours for its allies, America and the UK, under the Five Eyes Alliance. And there were amazing examples of plausibly deniable favours where, for example, Australian technical operators, people who did bugging and tapping were borrowed by the Brits. And MI6 would ring the Australians and say, I say, old chap, can I borrow one of your tech ops, lads? And we spoke to some of these people who were involved in these technical operations, and they told us how one of them had flown to Kuwait after the First Gulf War, and there was a huge amount of money going for contracts for the rebuilding of Kuwait, multi-billion-dollar fat, juicy cost-plus contracts. And there were Australian construction companies involved in bidding wars with British companies to win these incredibly lucrative contracts. And so the Brits secretly borrowed one of the technical operators' buggers from Australia to win a commercial advantage against Australia by bugging the Kuwaiti government officers on behalf of British intelligence. And it blew me away. I verified this directly with some of the people involved in the operation, that Australian spooks were used this way as plausibly deniable operatives to do things that the British wanted to be entirely off the books. And if they'd been caught doing it, it would have been my government, Australian government, that was compromised, not the Brits. And we've been doing this kind of dirty work for years in the Five Eyes Alliance. That story was like incendiary inside the Five Eyes Alliance. I know it upset a lot of people because it revealed the dirty little secret that the Kiwis and the Aussies, and to a lesser extent the Canadians, they do the shit that the Brits and the Americans want to deny, including spying on their allies and bugging, including in some cases their allies. And I met this group of people who'd been involved in these operations, and that was always in the back of my mind when I was investigating the UFO stuff. So when I later on started investigating UAP retrieval operations, I knew people from Special Forces in Australia, including retired Special Forces people who'd worked in a particular era when I knew there were allegedly American retrieval operations involving UFOs. And they told me they'd been involved in retrieval operations. And the incredible thing was,
wow,
the Australian government was never briefed into these retrieval operations.
Wow.
They were paid cash US dollars just to keep their mouths shut. They were asked to sign NDAs. And if you think about it, it's perfect.
Yeah.
There were no US personnel involved in this operation.
Right. Right. And it's not even...
The Australian government didn't know, and these guys walked away with fat checks and were kept very happy. This is why the fact of the Canadian involvement in retrievals and reverse engineering efforts has been kept so secret for so long. Because Canadian scientists have been and are involved in the Legacy program, and it's been kept secret from the Canadian people. And the only reason I'm aware of this stuff is because I know to look for it because of the stories I've done previously about things like Echelon and the plausibly deniable favors of secret services exchanging each other's men to do dirty tricks on each other. And that woke me up. I knew to ask the question when I was questioning people in the program, and they'd say, oh, yeah, I remember the Aussies. I remember that guy. Yeah. And it's interesting because people wanted to talk about it, because when I really pushed the issue, to come back to the actual question you'd asked me, there was no good reason for this to be kept secret. And that blew me away. And Harry Turner was the very early proponent of the fact that Australia was having the wool pulled over its eyes.
Yeah.
And I care about this issue because we're currently negotiating, we've actually agreed to buy $368 billion worth of Virginia-class nuclear attack submarines from your government in America because we supposedly need them as a strategic deterrence to deal with the Chinese. And what it's really all about is helping you guys fight the next war that they think they're going to have with China and maintaining American imperial hegemony. And there are a lot of people, including a former Australian Prime Minister I know, Paul Keating, who've said publicly, why are we so slavishly doing these things for the American alliance? And I think there's a fundamental deceit that lies at the heart of this alliance, and it's UAPs. And I've raised this at a very high level with our government, And I've had people in our government say to me, Ross, give me the evidence.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to link that document at the bottom of in the description of this video, because it's an amazing document.
It is.
It talks about crash retrievals. It confirms all these things that you have to kind of do deep research in the U.S. to even know, which is Blue Book is fake. Blue Book was this total PR, job to rationalize and explain away UFO sightings in the 50s and 60s. And then it goes into the fact that the real work around anti-gravity was going on. And you had people like Oppenheimer, Wheeler, Freeman Dyson, our top scientists, all investigating this stuff. And it even lists the outposts of the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence studying this. And it talks about University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where we know that they were funding Thomas Townsend Brown and all sorts of other, anti-gravity stuff. So it's a fascinating document. Speaking of the Marshall Islands, you, before me, actually broke this amazing story about bluegill triple prime.
Oh, yeah.
With Jeffrey Cruikshank, who is a really amazing researcher and also comes from the nuclear world. And what got you onto that story? And now, I want to talk about this with you because there's a little bit of controversy around Harold Malmgren.
Well, I know. And I've seen Jeff's also published a rebuttal to Douglas Dean Johnson's hatchet job.
I will link that too.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I haven't had a chance to read his rebuttal yet. I thought Douglas raised some legitimate points.
Totally.
And I'm really interested to see the academic argument back from Jeff. I just haven't had a chance to read it yet. But yeah, how did I get into that? I was, as a young man, I was living in New Zealand when these tests were happening in some cases. And it was, I can tell you, a big issue that both the Yanks and the French, particularly the French at Mururoa Atoll, were exploding thermonuclear weapons in our backyard. And I can remember, as a much younger journalist, I learned how to use the archives, and one of the early documents I found in the Australian archives was evidence of secret testing of animals for radiation residue from those nuclear experiments that were, at the time, kept from the Australian and New Zealand public. And there were nucleotides showing quite concerning levels of radioactive isotopes coming from weapons testing, including, by the way, Maralinga and other explosions that had taken place in islands off the coast of Australia that showed that, contrary to what the public had been told, there were radioactive elements getting into the blood and the bodies of human beings. And more importantly, there was a discernible sigma move, if you like, showing a statistical lift in cancer rates. And this was never revealed. It was never talked about. And I guess I grew up in that environment of deep skepticism. I was also living in New Zealand around the time of the attack by the French on the Greenpeace boat in Auckland Harbour, where an environmental vessel that was being used by Greenpeace to go and demonstrate against the Mururoa Atoll nuclear tests was blown up by the DGSA, French intelligence, an intelligence operation slap bang in the middle of Auckland Harbour. An incredible operation. Incredible French arrogance to think that they could do that and not get caught. And the stupid buggers, if they just hadn't tried to get the deposit back on their rental car, the French would have got away with one of the most awful crimes of that time of recent history. But, there was this sordid period where the great imperial powers of the world were looking for for real estate to explode their nuclear weapons. And both the US and France used the South Pacific or the Pacific. And it was a big political issue for me as a young man in New Zealand and much later in Australia as well. People were concerned about this. Why the hell are we allowing the Yanks to do this? And when Maralinga came out, very much in 1988, there was a huge court case by servicemen in the UK where all of the dirty secrets of Maralinga came out, and all of these horrible revelations of toxic radiation exposure were finally revealed. And the Maralinga Royal Commission remains, I think, one of the most sensational public inquiries of that era, because essentially it was crimes committed by the state on the justification of national security, exposing servicemen and women to high levels of radiation that in some cases killed people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the history, and that's the backdrop of some of these interesting UFO stories where
Sure.
we do have this well-documented, nuclear connection. You've interviewed Robert Hastings. I've interviewed Robert Hastings. And I do think it's interesting with this Malmgren case. I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to say that this actually happened. I don't know what you think. But
I'm not prepared to stake my hand to my heart and say I think Harold was telling the truth.
Yep.
I'm not prepared to say yet I think he was lying, and part of this is driven by my deep respect and admiration for Pippa.
Mm-hmm.
And I do feel the way Douglas did it was quite heartless and malicious.
Well,
in the way that he did it, that so soon after
I agree.
the death of a man who a family are still treasuring. I think it could have been done in a more gentle way. And I had the feeling a little bit too much when I was reading Harold's write-up, not Harold's, Douglas's write-up. This is Douglas Dean Johnson, who wrote an analysis of the claims of Harold Malmgren that substantiated the allegation that there was a UFO retrieved in the triple prime bluegill tests in the Pacific. And yes, it is odd that there's no paperwork that substantiates this, but is it possible, for example, that because of the role that Harold was playing, of course there was no paperwork?
Yes. Well, that is the historiography of the time, right? We are talking to an audience that probably believes that the CIA had a hand in killing JFK. Then you ask people.
I have no doubt.
No doubt. Right? Yeah, they're all sure. And then you ask, okay, so how'd that get coordinated? Who called the shots? And they're like, oh, it's Alan Dulles. Where was Alan Dulles at the time? Was he at the CIA? No, he wasn't. He was at the Brown Brothers Harriman, where he had left the CIA. We're also talking to an audience that loves to talk about Tim Taylor, this like really interesting character that inserts himself in Diana Pasulka's life, says he's part of the secret space stuff. And where was he working? He was NASA mission controller, but he was also at a federally funded research and development center called Aerospace Corporation. So that is the backdrop. That is the lens through which you have to understand that this guy is working at the Institute of Defense Analysis, another federally funded research and development
which I'm told by my intelligence friends is used as a front.
It is used as a front. He said in a 2024 interview with Robert Laird, the cover was that I was at the IDA, but in fact, I was actually helping the Joint Chiefs in the Pentagon.
I know he couldn't say this, and other people we both know can't reveal that they're CIA as well. But do you think it's possible Harold was CIA?
I do. And I'm going to be coming out with a more extensive video on this because I think it's important to say, and I actually wanted to say it as part of the story, but I wanted to respect his sort of gentlemanly desire to sort of keep it shut at the end. But okay, here are a few fun facts. If you watch that interview I did with him, he says, I was best friends with Tom Farmer, happened to be the GC, the general counsel of the CIA. He says, I was living at Nabokov's house. And then Pippa says, yeah, there's all these CIA connections with Nabokov. He says he helped create the Presidential Daily Brief, which is a CIA thing. I was holding Paul Mellon's walking stick. You think he bought that at a yard sale? Paul Mellon founded the CIA. So this is really important because a lot of the Douglas Dean Johnson, debunk is like, I spoke to an archivist here, I spoke to a person here, and they didn't know him. But the crux of it, the heart of it, is he didn't have a Q clearance. If that Q clearance came through him being part of the CIA, which he was part of the CIA, you wouldn't be able to query it. It wouldn't be in some FBI FOIA request.
It wouldn't be written down in a file and released to the public.
Absolutely not.
One of the things you can make a discretionary thing to do is to redact any evidence that somebody held a Q clearance.
Absolutely.
Because the fact of somebody holding a Q clearance is in and of itself potentially compromising a special access program.
Yes, totally. And the Institute of Defense Analysis has been formally, even on paper, involved in every single missile defense program after Bluegill. So Strat-X to THAAD and Aegis now to Star Wars in the 80s. IDA has its fingerprints over all of it. Not to mention, you'd appreciate this. Have you spoken to Bob Jacobs ever? 64?
Yeah, many times. Yeah.
So, I'm sure you have some great content with him. He's a really believable guy, in my opinion. He was deleted by the government, and then Mansman, his major in the Air Force.
What a brave act by Mansman.
To go back and
so this
say,
is a guy, just to explain to our audience,
Yeah.
this is a guy, Bob Jacobs, who, as a young captain in the US Air Force, was asked to photograph a fairly mundane launch of an ICBM test prototype missile from Edwards Air Force Base. In the course of the launch of that missile, they didn't know it at the time, but when they reviewed the film footage, there is a UFO circling the warhead and shooting at it with a laser beam. And, of course, the usual suspects attacked him when he came public in Omni magazine in the 70s and basically said he'd seen this and said that's just a load of nonsense. And to his great credit, I love one of the things I think we tend, I certainly do in the media, you tend to assume the worst about all military and all intelligence. But the thing I've learned, especially from reporting from war zones, is there really is an honor in the American officer class. And these men and women are inculcated with a decency that is drilled into them. It's a character thing to be truthful. And so the commanding officer of Bob Jacobs, he'd been there when they'd watched this film. And Bob asked him for support, and he supported him and verified that that's exactly what happened, and that these two, I think, CIA guys had basically told them to shut up about it.
That's exactly right. And so the update here, why Bob Jacobs is related at all to Malmgren, is people don't know this. I have footage of Bob Jacobs. Bob Jacobs was stationed at Johnston Atoll, but in 1963, so a year after Bluegill. Bob, you had such an interesting experience at Vandenberg in 64. I didn't realize you were actually stationed at the Marshall Islands before that, and that you were involved in the Operation Fishbowl tests. Is that right?
First of all, I was officer in charge of optical instrumentation at Vandenberg, the 13th Photo Squadron. As such, we were charged with high-speed instrumentation photography of every single missile launched down the Western Test Range. We had a detachment at Johnston Island in the Marshalls, and I was sent down there for a period of time in, I believe it was November of 1963, not 62. The scuttlebutt at the time by every single person on that island when I got there, this was engineers, technicians, my airmen who had been down there before me. We were told that what happened is the Soviets had launched a nuke into orbit up above us. And JFK told Khrushchev, take that down. Khrushchev said, I won't do it. JFK said, then we'll shoot it down. And Khrushchev said, you don't have the technology to do that. We were down there, according to the common talk at the time, to shoot down that nuclear missile, that nuclear weapon in orbit. I was told that launch had happened and that several things had happened because of it. First of all, something had fallen down toward the island from that explosion in the sky. The explosion lit up the entire South Pacific and caused all sorts of alarm and reports of UFOs and so on. And something had been recovered. I was never told what it was.
So that's fascinating. I actually want to be clear. The incident that I'm referring to is the Bluegill Triple Prime test, which is at the end of Operation Fishbowl in October of 1962. It's October 26th, so it's during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so you're saying that the kind of rumors at the time, at the bar sort of thing, were that Soviet warhead was actually knocked out of the sky as a part of that operation. Is that right?
That's what we understand, yes.
But here's what's interesting. We've never had nukes in space.
No.
And not to my knowledge. So unless there's some double story here where, we actually did take out a nuke in space, which I don't think we did.
It sounds like an ex post facto PSYOP disinformation operation.
That's right.
Yeah.
But even then, there were widespread rumors of people on the ground that there was a UFO shootdown that's taken place, and the only alternative is a nuke, which obviously isn't true. So I find that very interesting. Along with if there was a FOIA request in the National Nuclear Security Administration, and it was for everything, all these UFO related acronyms, and this was around Starfish Prime, so it was a little earlier. And they basically say the responsive records, we can't give you any of the responsive records, showing that there are responsive records with those names in them. And it says, with the subject matter expert, we have to consult them on this topic or whatever. So there's a lot, in my opinion, of circumstantial evidence to support.
Yeah, I mean, I keep on coming back to the fact that if there's a stinky, dirty secret, you don't write it down.
Right.
And if Harold, as he alleged, was working, for example, in the White House undercover, they wouldn't put his name in the address book. I'm still keeping an open mind, and I think it's slightly naive to think that everything would be written down.
Well, I've also seen his diaries, which are now in a safe place, and they're backed up, so don't mess with them. And I have seen a lot of meetings between Harold Malmgren and Richard Bissell.
Oh, wow.
In the diary. Richard Bissell, who founded Area 51, mayor of Area 51.
And it was key to Harold Malmgren's claims that he was read into the existence of the legacy UAP retrieval program by Richard Bissell.
There you go. Yeah. So
who went on to become a deputy director of the CIA.
That's right. He went on to become the number 2 at the CIA. So fascinating. Along the lines of what we were talking about earlier, you've probably met more people in and around these programs than anybody else alive from the outside.
Please don't say that too loudly. It's funny, when I came through on the weekend to come here, I was actually nervous. I've never been nervous coming into the US before, but there's been a lot of stories in the Australian press about young people who were just turned away by Border Protection for no good reason and harassed for no good reason. And there's been a change of culture at the border. And I have to admit, I had my computer on auto delete if it was opened.
Yeah.
When I came through customs.
Wow.
And I was ready to go live on national television if I was detained by Border Protection.
Wow.
Which actually happened to me after I did the Grusch story.
Really?
Yeah. After I did the Grusch story, I was detained and held by CBP.
Oh, my God.
And a mutual friend of ours made some inquiries and confirmed that there'd been some kind of a flag put on my file.
Unbelievable.
And unfortunately, it was so high level, they couldn't access it. But basically, somebody, I suspect from the agency, had flagged, we want to know when Coulthart comes through next, and let's cause him some mischief. And I have to admit, we have a euphemism in Australia, tearing somebody a new asshole. I just wasn't going to put up with it. And I summoned my anger and basically yelled at Border Protection and said, I strongly advise that you get on the phone, whoever it is that's flagged me, contact them now or tell them I will be going live on television in about 10 minutes to talk about the fact that I'm being illegally held. I have a valid visa. You have no good reason to hold me. If you want to fight, you can have one. And I was let out.
Good for you, man. Well, I think you're hopefully you're protected, and you're protected by the public, because I think
it's funny. I must confess I've been quite humbled coming to where we are, which is a
everybody
UFO.
Here knows who you are.
I've been mobbed.
Yeah, I believe it.
And it's funny. My wife and children think it's hilarious that there is this fandom. There's even a guy, God bless him, in Germany who's done a 3-dimensional model of me with far too much hair, which is quite flattering. God. It doesn't show the gut and it doesn't show the lack of hair. And my wife and children just wanted to know whether it had a bobblehead like this so we could stick it on the front of the car.
Oh, my God. That's amazing. That's hilarious.
But, I'm really touched by the fact that people care about this issue. And just to make it serious for a moment, the issue is still ridiculed in much of the British-style English language Australasian press. I get mocked and ridiculed by my journalist colleagues because I take UFOs seriously. And people will pejoratively sneer, how's your UFO obsession, Ross? Or there's actually a national broadcaster, the ABC in Australia, and one pompous twat on that broadcaster said, oh, Ross Coulthart, he's been investigating UFOs. He's either completely crazy or he's the best journalist ever.
That's the best compliment you could ever get.
But it was a snide. It was deliberately snide because the clear inference was I was a shithouse. You can't
be the best journalist.
I was a shithouse journalist, and I was obviously going crazy. But the thing I'm really heartened by is the degree of interest that sparked me getting hired by News Nation is incredible. When we did the David Grusch interview, News Nation, admittedly not at the time a very high-rating news channel.
No, you brought it on the map.
It escalated its ratings by 990%. That was written up in the industry press.
It's amazing.
And they still say to me that UFOs is the issue that saved the network.
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting issue because the audience, no matter what the mainstream media do to ignore this issue, you've got the doctrinaire attitude of the New York Times. We're not going to do UFO stories. We're going to reject the David Grusch story.
Which is crazy.
The Jake Barber story wouldn't fly in any of the national media.
Sure.
I don't think it's had a coverage anywhere.
I don't think it's had a coverage. Yes.
And yet the public, they make it clear they really want this story.
That's right.
And they can smell, another journalistic euphemism I'll give you, they can smell a smelly turd when they smell one.
Mm-hmm.
And this story stinks to high heaven.
Yeah.
And they can smell bullshit. And what fascinates me is particularly the younger generation. I'm amazed. I've never had a story. I've always been the kind of old fart of journalism, and doing investigative stories that not many people are really that interested in, but they matter because they're sort of interesting points of principle. This one really captures the imagination of the millennials and the X generation. It's amplifying what I do on News Nation. And I don't know how to use Instagram or TikTok, but there are kids that are making a living out of repackaging my stories on Instagram and TikTok. And my daughters are constantly coming to me saying, Dad, have a look at this. This guy's making a fortune over doing your stories on TikTok. And I go, look, I don't know how to do it. I haven't got time to do it. Good luck to them. It's great. But what it's done is it's generated this massive audience. And I'm not trying not to sound boastful, but, we're routinely getting millions of views for stories that, frankly, I'm genuinely surprised and excited and interested that people are watching them.
Well, you're doing an amazing job. And just a recent one, which I was watching in preparation for this, and I was so fascinated by, is you were in Sedona, Arizona.
Oh, yeah.
And it would, like, if you watch this video, it is the most mind-blowing video ever.
Let me tell you, I am in no doubt whatsoever, Jesse, that there is a deep underground military bunker that was built in the 1950s under Secret Mountain. That's what it's called. It's the hilarious thing. It's somebody's secret joke. It's called Secret Mountain.
Unbelievable.
Near Sedona. It's within 5-7 kilometers of Sedona. And more importantly, there's a place called Secret Canyon where there's allegedly a portal. Some kind of interdimensional portal. And I thought all of this was just crazy nonsense. But there are incredibly brave and super, super interesting people, Jeremiah Horstman and his wife, Alexandra, particularly, who live in Sedona, and they've been doing some really clever on-the-ground research. And one of the things we did, a lot of the stuff we got, as so often happens, you can't put it in the story because you can't get these people to go on camera. But there was a number of people who would privately admit that they'd been walking in what is public land, public parkland, and they'd be stopped by men with guns, men in uniform with automatic weapons, clearly highly trained elite soldiers, probably tier 1 operatives from the way they moved. And they would basically order people, go away or we will kill you. No mucking around. And there are sightings, numerous sightings of what we saw. I saw it with my own eyes. I was told that the best time of night is around about 1:30 in the morning. And if you looked at a particular place over Secret Mountain, you would see this big orb being escorted by helicopters rising from behind Secret Mountain. So I was skeptical, but we went out with a local lady, Melinda Leslie, who has some good quality military-grade night vision goggles, and we watched at 1:30 in the morning, and sure enough, up comes this beautiful golden orb, gigantic. It pulses, it's plasmatic, it slowly moves off, and the way it moved, you couldn't tell if it's because it got smaller or whether it went so fast that it just disappeared so quickly, but it just disappeared. And they were being escorted by military Black Hawk helicopters. dozens of them. I mean, the helicopter fuel bill alone for the evening that we're watching them must have been somewhere between $50,000 to $100,000. Somebody is paying huge money to operate orbs with no visible means of propulsion over Secret Mountain in Sedona. And it's funny because one of the people told us that if you want to hide something, you hide it in plain sight.
Mm.
And that's the best way to describe what's going on in what I think is happening in Sedona. And
do you think that's NHI, non-human? Do you think it's man-made? Or, okay.
I mean, there are allegations that base is NHI. I've had people who are psionic tell me that they have detected NHI in that area.
Sedona is also a strange place. It's a place everybody says when you go, weird stuff happens.
Yeah, no, it does.
Yeah.
And I never expected to see such overt displays of obviously anomalous technology in company with obviously military-style aircraft.
And you show footage, which is amazing. And then you also show all these sort of logical fallacies of the cover story where it's like, I think there's like a contract between Northern Arizona University, but like none of the professors ever show up or whatever.
And it's funny because what we're talking about is the Bradshaw Ranch.
Yes.
And there's allegedly a portal in the Bradshaw Ranch that was seen by the former owner of the ranch, Linda Bradshaw, and she actually took photographs of it. And it opened up in a particular area of the ground around that ranch, which just so happens to be the area that's fenced off. And we noticed that there is a tower in the middle of that area. This is supposedly a deserted ranch. There's nobody there. There's no electrical power. And there's solar panels on this post that has a camera. Now, if you're protecting the security of what is supposedly an academic research institution, you have the camera pointed out so that you can see people coming from the outside.
Yeah.
But you know where the camera's pointing?
Where?
It's pointing exactly at the point where Linda Bradshaw says she saw the portal. And then the other thing we noticed when we were there, and this was picked up by my friend Paul, who's an Australian ground-penetrating radar operator, he heard a humming. And he kicks a bush aside, and there's this gigantic three-phase power box with a cable definitely going into the ground.
Wow.
Three-phase power, and it's humming. And then we walk a bit further around, and there's another one. And there's massive amounts of electrical power going into the ground under Bradshaw Ranch. And we didn't put this in the feature-length film that we put to air on primetime, but it runs in the full-length interview with Paul, my friend. He did a ground-penetrating radar check on the road around Bradshaw Ranch, and we found a 50-foot wide reinforced steel concrete, highly visible on ground-penetrating radar, literally just under the ground.
Whoa.
I mean, I'm in no doubt whatsoever it's there.
Can you get down there?
No. I mean, I was half tempted to get a shovel and start digging, you know. But the interesting thing is, the other thing we learned about was there's an egress point into this whole secret facility called the Clarkdale Cement Plant. And the weird thing about it is it's nowhere near Secret Mountain. It's halfway between two mountain ranges. But if you run a direct line between those two mountain ranges and put it through Bradshaw Ranch where we know there's a tunnel, or at least we picked up the tunnel, and if you match the walls of the tunnel with where it goes directly to the Clarkdale Cement Plant. And one of the things we heard about from locals was that 20 years ago, the drilling was so intense that things were shaking on their bookshelves, and they were obviously tunneling underneath the village at Clarkdale where these people live. And people were even compensated for damage.
Wow.
And, I mean, I don't understand as a journalist. I mean, I've been taught journalism to do the work on the ground and go and ask the question. Don't accept what you're told by some defense PR flunky. Go in and check and do the basic checking. And I think the interesting thing is that this is all coming out at a time in journalism where, sadly, investigative journalism is in serious decline. Because even the great masthead newspapers like the New York Times, the Wash Post, the LA Times, the Boston Globe, the Baltimore Sun, papers I grew up, like, I didn't have Bay City rollers on my wall. I used to paste up big newspaper investigations. That's what I always wanted to be. And it's sad because that era of great big budget investigative journalism where they would deploy teams of people to go and investigate stuff, it's well and truly over. And the big unspoken secret about the New York Times is even the New York Times doesn't have the resources to do this kind of journalism. But all you need to do, if I was the editor of a newspaper today, I would put 10 days into deploying a couple of investigative journalists to go up from Phoenix and have a look at what I saw in Sedona, and you will find a deep underground military facility that is highly protected, has hydraulically operated doors in the side of mountainsides, and is secretly operating what I suspect is non-human technology.
It's amazing. And it corroborates, Larry Saunders, who wrote a book about deep underground military bases. Richard Saunders, sorry, thank you. And Catherine Austin Fitts, who talks about large, trillions of dollars missing from the federal budget, from the DoD budget, to go towards these projects. So, and then Nat Kobitz's story, another story, Randy Anderson's story. So,
at what point, though, this is the thing I don't get. I really don't get it. It's almost like there's a willful blindness in. Because why do we expect the mainstream media to follow this? Because they should.
Yeah.
They
really should. It's like the most interesting, important thing. And it's, if you talk about like an Archimedes lever, like the point of most leverage, I mean, you can cover like local grifts, right? But why don't you cover like the trillions of dollars missing from the DoD's budget, or why don't you, this stuff?
No, I love that quote. And it's a true quote. I actually dug it out when I was writing my book, that Donald Rumsfeld admitted that there was something, is it $23 trillion missing from the defense budget?
2.1 trillion missing in an audit the day before 9/11 happened.
Yeah, the day before 9/11. Yeah. Trillions of dollars are disappearing from the American defense budget.
Documented.
And that's actually one thing I really liked about what Doge was doing.
Yeah.
Musk was basically saying, why the hell do you not have the acquittal numbering that allows you to reconcile what this money is for with where it's being spent?
Well, there was an amazing, I think it was like Babylon Bee, like headline or something, and it was Elon Musk leaves job of making government more efficient for easier job of allowing humans to occupy Mars, which is like, this guy doesn't give up on anything. A successful car company hadn't been built in the U.S. since like the 1910s or something. And you have him build Tesla. You have him single-handedly resuscitate, a version of NASA with SpaceX, and he gives up with the government efficiency.
I had to interview Elon in 2015.
That's amazing.
For
I didn't know
Australian
that.
60 Minutes.
Wow. How was that?
Well, it was funny because I honestly, genuinely had the feeling that like 1% of his brain was answering my questions and the other 99% was working on another problem.
Right.
But the thing I was really impressed with was he was excited to show me around the SpaceX factory in LA because that was where they were building the new rockets. And a lot of the people in SpaceX, but particularly in the Tesla factory right next door, are Aussies. Because the Australians had laid off all of their car industry. We completely destroyed, in an act of utter stupidity, our entire car industry. And so a lot of those engineers went to work for Elon, and he loved Aussie engineers. But the thing I was really impressed with was he knew more about every aspect of the production line than anybody that he was showing us that day. And it wasn't some big performance. He really did know. And he was asking about metal tolerances and, he really knew his stuff. Yeah. Every aspect of that production line, he knew intimately. And you could see he had everybody on his toes. And frankly, that's, if you're going to be running a rocket business or an electric car business, that's exactly the kind of proprietor you want.
Yeah. No, he's incredibly impressive.
Yeah.
He has a unique mind and ability to make things happen.
Albeit, I'm sure he's probably highly annoying to live with.
I'm sure. And probably hiding something when it comes to the UFO issue, because why?
I think he's been read in.
I think he has to.
I've been told he's been read in.
I think so too. Speaking of which, speaking of high-level people that you've spoken to, you were interviewed by Don Jr., by the son of the sitting president before you broke the Jake Barber story. What was that like, and did it give you any hope as far as American movement on disclosure at the highest level?
Well, if Don Trump Sr. listens to his son, Don Trump Jr. is very engaged and interested in UFOs, and in a really well-informed way as well. I mean, he's been briefed by a lot of people, and there's been a lot of, well, not a lot, but there's been multiple secret briefings of the Trump camp before they came into government. And it's interesting because I am persuaded, not at the moment though I'm seeing any action, but I am persuaded that people like Tulsi Gabbard, Nash Patel in the FBI, Tulsi, of course, is the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe at the CIA. These are all people who've previously expressed a strong desire to get to the truth of the UAP mystery. And I don't think it's any coincidence that Representative Anna Paulina Luna, when she was tweeting earlier this week about what a hopeless cause ARROW is, that's the Pentagon UFO Investigation Office.
Good for her.
She made the observation that they were obviously a waste of money and should be defunded.
That's right.
She implied that the money should go to someone else, and I think that's the FBI she's talking about.
Yeah.
Because I'm told that the briefing that the FBI gave in Congress really blew people away. And watch that FBI ongoing investigation. I've dealt with some of the people on the investigation team.
Yep.
And I like G-men.
Yeah.
They're like dogs on a bone.
Yep.
And they're looking at crimes.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, if what we're talking about here is true, David Grusch, Jake Barber, they have insinuated and alleged outright in Jake's case that people have been murdered.
That's right.
To protect this secret.
Yeah.
It's a capital crime.
Yeah.
There are people who I suspect are very nervous right now in the Legacy program because they are under active FBI investigation.
Yeah, I wonder what the mentality is of
arrogance.
Somebody, probably.
Smug
right?
arrogance. I have no doubt they think they're going to get away with it. And you know what?
What?
They probably will.
Oh, no, don't say that.
No, I'm pretty bleak. I'm not. I actually had an argument earlier on today, actually. Well, not an argument, but a free and frank exchange of views with a lawyer who's been liaising with Congress. And they were having a bit of go at me because I'd talked about how I'm talking to Legacy program whistleblowers who want to come forward.
Yeah.
But they're wary of coming forward. And they took a swipe at me and basically said, we've got all these protections in Congress. You should bring them in and encourage them to come in. And I said, well, hang on a bloody moment. Look at what they've done with David Grusch's allegations.
That's right.
Sweet FA.
Yeah.
You know, David gave them first-hand direct information from his sources of where to look, where to find the spacecraft.
Yes.
Where to literally go and open the door. Oh, by the way, there's a spacecraft recovered from Aztec.
Yeah.
Open this door. Oh, yeah, that's the one from Kingman.
That's right.
You know, who's the person in charge? What's the title of the program? What's the code name? He gave them chapter and verse. How many subpoenas have been issued, Senate Select Committee for Intelligence, for any of that information? Nada.
So crazy.
Fucking nada. And so I don't think Congress is doing its job. And frankly, I do get the impression that congressional staffers are captive to the defense establishment.
Yeah, I mean, that feels right. I mean, the last time around, the UAPDA was killed by Mike Turner, where, like, you know, his largest donors were all defense.
No, but I mean, it's funny because, I mean, a lot of the work is done in this preliminary investigation of allegations made by people like David Grusch, by people like Lou Elizondo, people like Jake Barber, when they've gone in and given evidence in camera, in skiffs, as they all have done to the Congress. The people that have been sitting there have been staffers.
Yep.
And they're good people. They're well-intentioned, good people. But one of the things Jake Barber told me when he was giving his direct evidence of the Legacy program, first-person evidence. I mean, people say, where's the evidence?
Yeah.
The first-person evidence of Jake Barber was given to the Senate Select Committee for Intelligence.
Yes.
And one of the staffers on that committee was concerned for his own safety and asked Jake, are you able to help me get security because somebody from the Defense Department is ordering helicopters to fly across and over my home. They're harassing my home. And that's the kind of thing that the Defense Department was doing. They were buzzing a guy with Black Hawk helicopters just hovering over his home as an act of intimidation. A staffer working for the Congress.
I know exactly who you're talking about, and he was providing a pipeline of legacy operators to basically talk to the Senate, the Select Senate Committee. On
So I'm not blaming the staffers
Yeah.
because these people are intimidated. They have families too.
Yeah.
And I don't think the public realize that this is how the game is being played. You've got a vast national security state, and it is truly a deep state protecting itself, its self-interest, misusing the resources of the state, your money, your taxpayer dollars, to essentially bully and intimidate, and in some cases murder people.
Yeah.
And that's where I sort of go, there are so many times when I sit back in this story and I go, hell's bells. This is like a thriller. It's like a John Grisham thriller.
Truly.
But it's true.
Yes.
And it's being ignored by the premier national security reporters of the land. I mean, any sane, rational editor who has an ounce of journalistic respect for himself and his bones would deploy staff to at least go and check out the basic allegations.
See if the 170-odd Q-cleared, people seeing UFOs around our most sensitive sites, shutting them down in certain cases, might be somewhat credible. Like maybe check that out. Yeah, it's crazy.
But you know what I'm enjoying? I'm enjoying the tyranny of the internet. The fact that you and I are actually generating programs. In your case, you're actually making a living by the looks of it, doing stories on this phenomenon and reporting on it. And it's interesting because that proves to me there is an audience there that want this stuff.
Oh, yeah. There really is, and I think it resonates deeply with what they intuit about reality themselves, which is that there's more, and that there have been sort of secret programs around these things hidden from them for a very long time, and with AI and with the internet, you can vigilante corroborate and research a lot of this stuff yourself, and so I think people are waking up post-pandemic. As much as I share your pessimism around government action on the topic, I do think the larger, public is waking up to these broader realities, and that's exciting.
I'll tell you this. Yeah. If you accept psionics, which of course the debunkers won't, they're saying disclosure is coming.
Interesting. Wow.
Yeah.
Well,
there's a perturbation in the force, Luke.
Yeah. Well, hey, I think the government itself accepts psionics, as we know, through their remote viewing programs.
That's the other doublethink. We're told, and there's a whole movie made about it, debunking the idea of telepathy and psychics and psionics. Yeah. And yet you've only got to read the CIA gateway documents in the CIA files, and they show that that's actually not true.
Yes.
That essentially everybody took it very, very seriously. And I've spoken to people who've confirmed that there is still an ongoing psionic operation being run in the Pentagon.
Clearly. Well, the nominal reason for shutting it down in 1995 was there was only offense. There was no defense. Why would you shut a program down where there's still offense and it's still working offensively?
Absolutely.
Makes no sense.
Yeah, no, I don't know why people buy this. Is it because they're so distracted covering the Ukraine war or, I don't get it. I mean, at what point did the lack of curiosity begin?
I don't know. Well, it's something I've found anecdotally that I wonder if this is in accordance with your experience. Meeting a lot of these guys with long government histories and serious credentials, they're often more conspiratorial than people in the public. You expect a conspiracy theorist to be this tinfoil hat, they live in their mom's basement or something. Yeah. They're watching crazy shit on the news. But no, these people have serious credentials. Their version of reality is way weirder than the average person in public's reality.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's how I felt when I started getting into psionics, because one of the first things that one of my sources in that Georgetown pub back in probably 2018 told me was, it's all about consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I had no idea what he was talking about.
Right. Right.
And it really has taken me probably 7 years to actually begin to understand. And now I'm realizing more and more it's all about consciousness.
Yeah.
It really is.
I agree. So much is downstream of that. Well, Ross, this has been an honor. I have one final question before you go. Is there anything? Joe Rogan just talked about this. Everybody talks about this amazing bombshell thing that you reported on. You know what I'm going to say?
Yeah.
This UFO possibly found in that they needed to build a bunker around that was like, a mile plus long. Anything you can say about it?
I do not resile from saying what I've said previously, which is that there is a buried, or at least built upon, UFO that was too big to move.
And that's it.
Part of the reason it's actually, it's weird just how angry people get because I can't reveal it. And there seems to be this view in UAP social commentary that I'm obliged to reveal everything.
No.
And if I don't reveal everything, then I'm being irresponsible and I'm not helping the disclosure cause. And one of the things that was steeped into me as a journalist, I've been privy because people started leaking to me things that they probably shouldn't have done, to secrets where, including from America, I should not have them. And I've been shocked that I've had these things in my hand and I've gone, holy hell. And in some cases, I've burnt them.
Wow.
But the worst one for me was when I covered I was made aware that Australia was deploying special forces troops into the Iraq desert, probably 3 weeks before the war started. And a friendly special forces operator told me that this was happening. And I initially got really excited. And I actually went and spoke to an editor about it and said, look, I've got this story. I mean, they're deploying SAS troops. We're going in, we're going to be in the Western Desert. And then we kind of looked at each other and went, nah. and I spoke later on. I did a story with the Australian SAS about what they'd done in the Western Desert. And I asked one of the guys who'd been there, if I'd revealed that, what would have happened? And he said, we would have been killed.
Oh my God. Well, there you go.
And so in the case of the buried UFO, I can't reveal, because if I reveal why I say this, it would compromise it. It's a very sensitive place. That should be enough of a guide for you. And to reveal the full extent of what I know would compromise the lives of young men and women who are doing good things for America, completely separate from the UAP program, and they're probably oblivious to what's sitting downstairs.
That's as valid a reason as ever. And it also, to argue on your behalf against the people that say that's bad for disclosure, you're going to torpedo your relationships. If
Absolutely.
you are speaking to somebody, they're never going to speak to you again if you reveal something that you promised not to. So,
because I actually take it as a journalistic responsibility not to reveal something if it's going to compromise the safety of your country or my country.
Absolutely.
And we are. I lie in bed at night worried about how dangerous things are at the moment. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Israel launched a preemptive attack on Iran in the next few weeks.
I wouldn't either. The world's in a freaky place. And I think, I don't know if you have this kind of mind dialectic around the UFO issue, but I think about that. And I'm like, oh, maybe UFOs don't matter. The world's going to blow up. And then I say, well, if the world's going to blow up, if there were ever a time to care about UFOs and throw a Hail Mary, it would be now.
Well, one of the things I asked somebody very recently was, is there some kind of super weapon that we've got stashed away? Because I've heard this rumor, and look, to be honest with you, it's only rumor. It's people who probably wouldn't really know for sure, but they've told me secondhand stuff suggesting that the US has developed what are called scalar weapons.
Well, you heard the Michael Kratzia statement.
But we are capable of so much more. Our technologies permit us to manipulate time and space. They leave distance annihilated.
Which, he's in an official position, and he's...
And I know, and Trump keeps on hinting that the US has a weapon, a super weapon.
That's right.
That they haven't revealed yet. Yeah. But notice, Putin has said exactly the same thing. And I have been told that the Russians have developed extraordinary weaponry, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if one of the primary reasons for the secrecy is because each nation thinks that they have an advantage with scalar weapons, but the reality is none of them do.
Right. Oh, wow. That's scary that there's some sub-rosa Manhattan Project 2.0 going on.
Oh, I'm sure there's a Manhattan Project 2.0 going.
Well, you have these rumors that you had Kammlerstab in Nazi Germany where they were doing kind of black world nuclear stuff.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I'm sorry, we were trying to finish, but I'll just give you this little tip.
We talk forever, yeah.
There's a friend of mine who speaks to a lot of astronauts and to people who supervised astronauts.
Okay.
And one story that came up was that in the early days of Glasnost, when Russia and America were kind of friends again, Russia imparted to America that it was in possession of a crashed craft, and there was an astronaut, a known astronaut, still alive, deployed to go and, actually I don't know if he's still alive, to go and assist in the retrieval. And a lot has changed in the last, 25 years, since 30 years since the end of the Cold War. 35 years. And it's really interesting because I suspect that there has been collaboration in the distant past between the Americans and the Russians, and that it's suited each side to keep quiet about the fact that there is this sub-rosa Manhattan Project going on where essentially there's a Cold War. There's a battle for possession of and development of non-human technology, and I'm in no doubt whatsoever that that's happening.
Well, that's an amazing note to end on, which is let's hope disclosure happens and these psionic viewers are correct before the world blows up.
Me too.
Ross, this is an honor, man. It's a long time coming for me, and it's amazing to hear all your vast knowledge and all this stuff, and pray for your continued productivity because you're really doing the Lord's work.
Well, vice versa, Jesse. I love your show, and there's plenty of room there for both of us.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Ross.